Let's talk about punctuation basics. Punctuation is extremely important. Let's consider these two sentences. A woman without her man is nothing. Sounds bad, right? Not a very good statement. Through the simple insertion of punctuation, though, it completely changes meaning. A woman, dash, without her, comma, man is nothing. One sentence without the punctuation is derogatory. The next one with the punctuation honors women. Let's start with commas. All right, the first thing you need to know is that commas do not go where you take a breath or a pause. Commas do not occur arbitrarily, and you should just not plop them in anytime you think you need a pause in a sentence. There are very specific rules that go along with commas. I'm going to focus on the four most important rules, the four uses of commas that teachers and editors focus on. The first is that commas always go after an introductory phrase or clause. So, for instance, after the party, comma, he left. That's an opening prepositional phrase, so it ends with a comma. Consider the next sentence that begins with a subordinate clause. Because he was tired, comma, he went home to sleep. Commas always go before a coordinating conjunction when connecting two sentences. Remember that coordinating conjunctions are the fanboys: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And anytime you connect two sentences with any coordinating conjunction, a comma always goes before the conjunction. So, the bird flew into the fan, comma, and the house exploded. A silly sentence, but we're focusing on how we use a comma. So here's the first sentence, here's the second sentence. When they're connected with a coordinating conjunction, the comma goes before. You also use commas to set off appositives or non-restrictive relative clauses. These are insertions in a sentence that either rename the subject or re-describe the subject that are not essential to the meaning of the sentence. So, my occupation, comma, professor, comma, is a stimulating one. See how professor simply renames my occupation? That's how we know it's in a positive. Consider the second sentence. My wife, comma, who lives in New Jersey, comma, is a butcher. Who lives in New Jersey is merely additional information about the wife. That's why it is set off with commas. Who lives in New Jersey is a non-restrictive relative clause. And finally, we use commas to set off items in a series. The cake was moldy, comma, stale, comma, and hard. Some people will argue that you do not need the comma after stale because and does the job. But we always, to have clarity, we want to have commas after all the items in a series so that we aren't confused as to whether the last two items are in a positive, modifying the first word in the series. So, for instance, he liked, consider this sentence, he liked dinner, comma, lobster, and cake. Is then, if you don't have a comma after lobster, does lobster and cake re-describe as dinner, or are they three separate things? To avoid that confusion, we put a comma after each item. A semicolon has two very specific uses in the English language. You use a semicolon to separate two closely related independent clauses. I went home, semicolon, Bill stayed. There's two sentences. I went home, Bill stayed. A sentence is an independent clause. That's just another name for a sentence. I went home, Bill stayed. You don't have anything in between them. There's no and, so we use a semicolon. You also use semicolons to separate items in a list when those items themselves are internally punctuated. So, the party was attended by Bill, comma, the clown, semicolon, Joey, comma, the axe murderer, semicolon, and Kevin, comma, the professor. If we didn't have the semicolons here and we just use all commas, we wouldn't know if the party included 6 people or 3. Once again, commas separate independent clauses. And they're most commonly used when you have two independent clauses connected, and one independent clause, usually the second independent clause, begins with what is called a conjunctive adverb, like however, nonetheless, moreover. So here's the most common use for a semicolon. Use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses when the second one begins with a conjunctive adverb. I went to the store, semicolon, however, comma, it was closed. Colons, everybody knows that you use a colon to introduce a list or a quote, but you use a colon only when what comes before the colon is a complete sentence. Okay, so consider this. Here are the items you need, colon, space, a chainsaw, comma, rope, comma, and butter. Okay, since here are the items you need, that's a complete sentence, so the colon is completely appropriate there. Do not do things like this. The items are, colon. You never put punctuation between required parts of a sentence, so a colon should not be between the predicating verb are and the subject complements chainsaw, rope, and butter. Okay, you either would, in this case, delete the colon and just say the items are a chainsaw, rope, and butter, or put a complete sentence before the colon. Let's talk about the dash. The dash, one makes a dash by typing two hyphens. Do not confuse a hyphen with a dash. We'll talk about hyphens in a minute. A dash consists of two hyphens, and there are no spaces on either side of it. And what do we use a dash for? A dash is used to signal an abrupt insertion or to set off a dramatic sentence appositive. Let me explain. An abrupt insertion would be when you want to add information in the middle of a sentence. For instance, the qualities of Monet's paintings, dash, his brushstrokes, his use of light, his color, dash, okay, are what makes Monet distinctive. Okay, consider it's sort of the opposite of a parenthetical insertion. And then the other one is the other use of a dash is to set off a sentence appositive. And that's when you want to give dramatic emphasis at the end of a sentence. You state your sentence, put in a dash, and then add a little extra information at the end. A sentence appositive is a phrase that modifies the previous sentence. So, the gerbil gave me a look, dash, the most evil look I had ever seen. Think of the dash as dramatic music. The gerbil gave me a look, dash, dun dun dun, the most evil look I had ever seen. Let's talk about two common sentence problems. First of all is the run-on sentence. And a run-on sentence is not a sentence that is long or that goes on and on. The technical definition of a run-on sentence is a run-on sentence occurs when two or more sentences are fused together with no punctuation at all. He went to the store, it was closed. Notice that one sentence ends after store, the next sentence begins at it, and there's nothing between. Comma splices. A comma splice is one of the most frequently marked errors in students' papers. Okay? Most people know how to avoid run-on sentences, but they mistakenly fix run-on sentences by inserting a comma between the two sentences. Bill went to the store at night, comma, he found it closed. That is wrong. That is a comma splice. A comma cannot be used to connect two sentences. So we could fix by inserting a conjunction. Bill went to the store at night, comma, but he found it closed. Or with a semicolon. Bill went to the store at night, semicolon, he found it closed. Now let's talk about some other marks of punctuation, some other issues with punctuation. And first of all, let's talk about italics. Okay, when do you italicize something? Generally, according to MLA guidelines, you italicize titles of books, movies, boats, musical compositions, and works of art. So you italicize major things, and minor things like individual poems, individual songs, short stories, those go in quotation marks. In the past, when we used typewriters, people would underline words to indicate they should be italicized. We don't need to do that anymore, just use italics. In fact, from a visual standpoint and a typographical standpoint, you should never underline anything anymore. Underlining just simply shouldn't be used. It doesn't lend to visual appeal, and it's completely unnecessary. When do you capitalize something? Well, capitalization is tricky and subjective often and depends upon the context and when you're writing. But in general, when do you capitalize something like dad or father or mother in a sentence, or president, something like that? How do you know? Well, a good rule to follow is the Bob rule, and that is this. If you can replace the word in question with Bob, then capitalize. That is, if you can replace the word you're wondering about with a proper noun, then capitalize it. So, I saw Mom at Sylvia's back door, okay? In this case, you could say I saw Bob at Sylvia's back door, so Mom should be capitalized. But consider the next sentence. I saw my father at McDonald's. You cannot say I saw my Bob at McDonald's, so you wouldn't capitalize it. Let's talk about hyphens. Okay, a hyphen is used to indicate a two-word adjective before a noun. When you have a two-word adjective before a noun, it should be hyphenated. So, fast-running river, orange-red hair, 6-year-old boy. If the adjective, multi-word adjective, comes after the noun, for instance, we say the boy is 6 years old, then it's not hyphenated, only when it comes before. Ellipses. We all know that an ellipses means that you're leaving something out, something that was in the original text. Please note that an ellipses is 3 dots, okay? Ellipses, it consists of 3 dots, all right? Notice the use there. There's no space, no extra spaces between the 3 dots, and there are spaces on each side of the 3 dots. Sometimes you may see 4 dots. What that means, for instance here, his reaction floored me. Okay. And the 4th dot is actually the period. It's indicated that something was left out of the sentence and the sentence ended with a period here. And then finally, please remember that in American typography, this is completely just a completely random decision, but American typographers, to distinguish themselves from the British, decided that commas and periods would always go inside quotation marks. So in America, this is an infallible rule. Commas and periods always go inside quotation marks. He called the judge, quote, a jerk, comma, end quote, a moron, comma, end quote, and a lunatic, period, quote. That's true in all cases.